The story of Keziah begins in the quiet aftermath of a storm that almost erased everything Job once knew. The dust of sorrow still clung to the corners of his home, even after restoration had touched his life like sunlight returning after a long eclipse. In that delicate transition between grief and renewal, God planted a new chapter, not through riches or possessions, but through the birth of a daughter whose very name carried the essence of transformation. Keziah arrived not as a replacement for what had been lost, but as a living symbol that pain, when surrendered to the divine, becomes the soil where deeper beauty grows. Her name, drawn from the aromatic cassia, was more than a poetic detail. Cassia was known for releasing its fragrance only when crushed, pressed, or heated, a process that mirrored the journey Job had walked through. He had been broken by affliction, stripped of certainty, and shaken at the foundation of his faith. Yet what emerged from that ordeal was a scent of worship far purer than before. Keziah embodied that truth. She was the fragrance of restoration, the reminder that suffering does not end a story but reshapes it. In a culture where lineage flowed through the names of sons, the mention of Job's daughters carved a silent declaration into history. Ancient customs often erased the presence of women, but the scripture deliberately preserved the names of Jemimah, Keziah, and Keren-Happuch. That choice alone shattered expectations. It was as though God placed a bookmark in the narrative, inviting future generations to pause and see that his restoration does not follow human rules or cultural hierarchies. Keziah's presence in the text was a quiet revolution. The land of Uz, where she was born, carried layers of memory, some bright, some bitter. It was a region touched by trade routes and perfumes, a place where fragrances traveled farther than gold. For Keziah, growing up in such an atmosphere meant living in a world where scent and symbolism intertwined. Every breeze carried hints of spices from distant deserts, and perhaps it was this environment that shaped the deeper meaning of her name. Her very existence echoed the truth that God breathes new aroma into what once smelled of loss. Job's home, though restored, still bore the fingerprints of grief. Laughter returned carefully, as if afraid of waking old ghosts. The servants walked softly, and every celebration carried the shadow of remembrance. Keziah entered that space not with answers, but with presence. She was the quiet reminder that healing does not erase the past. It transforms it into wisdom. Her childhood became a bridge between what had been shattered and what was rising again. Her father, once a man crushed by calamity, now looked at life with a reverence carved by suffering. When he held Keziah in his arms, he held more than a child. He held proof that God's restoration reaches deeper than material return. It rebuilds from the inside out. Perhaps that is why Scripture preserved her name. Not because of great deeds, but because she represented what happens when the divine breath touches the broken. In the early years of her life, Keziah would hear whispers of her family's story, tales told in careful tones, as if handling something sacred. She learned that pain was not a punishment, but a path through which God revealed himself more clearly. While others admired her beauty, the true fragrance she carried was unseen. It was the aroma of a house that had learned to trust God, not only in abundance but in ashes. Her presence turned her family's tent into a sanctuary of remembrance. Every time someone spoke her name, they unknowingly repeated a testimony. The crushed can still release sweetness. Keziah grew up surrounded by an unspoken truth, that she was part of a divine message written not in words, but in essence. She was the gentle echo of a God who rebuilds differently than humans expect. Though the world around her upheld men as the carriers of legacy, Keziah held a legacy of a different kind. She was a living memorial of renewal, a reminder that God lifts what has fallen and gives purpose to what was once overlooked. Her story began not in victory but in vulnerability, and that made her existence all the more profound. Even as a child, Keziah sensed that the atmosphere around her carried layers of meaning. The silence of her home was not empty, it was reverent. The laughter that returned carried gratitude, not naivety, and her own life seemed woven with threads of grace that stretched back to the moment her father cried out in despair. She was born into restoration, yet bound to the memory of suffering. The meaning of her name followed her like a shadow of light. Cassia's fragrance was known for lingering long after the fire faded, and perhaps that was God's intention too, that her life would carry a scent of faith that remained even when words were forgotten. She was not simply Job's daughter, she was the embodiment of a divine truth, that God can turn the bitter into the beautiful when the heart refuses to let go of him. Keziah grew up in a home where every sunrise felt like a quiet miracle. The echo of past sorrow still lingered in the air, but it no longer carried the weight of despair. Instead, it served as a reminder of how far God had brought them. The land of Uz, once shadowed by tragedy, became the stage for rebirth. The songs of the servants, once restrained and heavy, gradually regained warmth. And in the center of this healing atmosphere, Keziah learned that restoration is not merely an event, but a slow unfolding of grace. Her father, Job, often walked the edges of the fields at dawn, the same fields where he once cried out in anguish. Keziah would watch him from a distance, sensing a tenderness in his steps, as though each trace of his feet on the soil were a prayer without words. He was a man who had seen the depths of human suffering, yet the gentleness in his eyes revealed something greater, a resilience carved by divine encounter. Keziah understood early on that her father's faith was not built on blessings, but on survival through fire. Inside the household, stories of loss were spoken sparingly, not because they wished to forget, but because some memories had become sacred. Keziah often found herself listening in silence as the older servants described the days when the house had been filled with mourning. Their voices carried both sorrow and awe, sorrow for what had been taken, and awe for the God who had restored more than anyone thought possible. These whispered testimonies shaped the way she viewed her own existence, not as a coincidence, but as a continuation of divine purpose. Though the family was prosperous once again, Keziah could sense that true prosperity had little to do with wealth. She saw how her father valued peace more than possessions, how he embraced simplicity with gratitude, and how he never spoke of restoration with pride, but with humility. To her, it seemed that God had not only restored Job's fortunes, he had restored his vision. And Keziah felt that she, in some hidden way, was part of that restoration. Her life represented something delicate, the fragrance after the crushing. Growing up in a patriarchal society, Keziah quickly realized that her position was unusual. Most girls her age were rarely mentioned in family records, much less expected to inherit anything of value. Yet, the way her father looked at her and her sisters carried a message deeper than culture. He saw them as reflections of God's new promise. Keziah learned early that her worth was not anchored in tradition, but in the divine narrative that surrounded her birth. That knowledge became a quiet strength within her. Her beauty was often praised, but Keziah sensed that there was something more meaningful behind the admiration. When people looked at her, they were not seeing just physical beauty. They were seeing the visible fruit of a restoration that defied human logic. The glow in her features was not vanity, it was testimony. She felt like a lantern carrying the light of a God who rebuilds the broken in unexpected ways. Her life was not a replacement of the past, but a declaration of hope. As she grew older, Keziah became increasingly aware of the tension between blessing and memory. There were evenings when the house filled with laughter, and yet she sensed a quiet ache beneath her parents' smiles. It was not grief, it was remembrance. Keziah learned that healed hearts still carry the outlines of old wounds, not as weaknesses, but as reminders of how deeply grace had reached. She felt connected to a lineage shaped not by privilege, but by endurance. The aroma of cassia, burned during ceremonial gatherings, often filled the air in their home. For Keziah, that aroma felt strangely familiar, as if it belonged to her. She would sit near the lamps and watch the smoke curl upward, realizing that her name carried a similar destiny. Just as cassia had to be bruised to release its fragrance, she sensed that her life, too, would embody a truth born from brokenness. The association gave her a sense of calling, one she could not yet fully understand but felt deeply. People often visited her father seeking counsel, drawn by the wisdom he had earned through anguish. Keziah observed these encounters closely. She saw how Job listened, not with the confidence of someone who knew all the answers, but with the humility of someone who had been torn apart and rebuilt by God's hands. It taught her something crucial. Wisdom is not inherited through peaceful days, but forged in the furnace of trial. She carried that truth like a seed, waiting for its time to bloom. Her siblings adored her, but even they sensed something different about Keziah. While Jemimah embodied light and Keren Happuch radiated splendor, Keziah carried an intangible stillness. She was like the quiet after rain, the moment when the world smells new again. Those close to her often described her presence as comforting. though they could not explain why. Keziah simply smiled, for she knew her life was meant to reflect the fragrance of something divine. Despite her gentle spirit, Keziah faced internal challenges. She often wondered why God chose to place her at the center of a story that began long before her birth. The weight of symbolism, being the child named after a fragrance released by crushing, was sometimes overwhelming. But with time, she learned that God does not assign names to burden people but to guide them. Her name was not a reminder of pain, it was a promise of purpose. And so, in the quiet rhythm of daily life, Keziah began to embrace her identity. She was not merely the daughter of a restored man, she was the living echo of what restoration meant. Her birth did not erase the ashes of the past, but it brought fragrance to them. And as she walked through her home, touching the memories that lingered like faded threads, Keziah felt the gentle certainty that her life was not an accident. She was part of a divine re-beginning. Keziah entered adolescence carrying a quiet awareness that her life was woven with threads of mystery. While her sisters were celebrated openly for their beauty and charm, the essence of her presence was felt rather than seen. People often struggled to describe what made her remarkable, yet they left her company with a strange sense of peace. Her silence wasn't emptiness, it was depth. Keziah learned early that some lives are not meant to echo loudly in history, but to whisper truths that change the atmosphere around them. The stories of her father's suffering followed her like distant thunder. She heard them not as tales of misfortune, but as sacred markers along the path that shaped who she was becoming. Whenever she passed the spots where Job once scraped his wounds or cried under the weight of despair, she felt an inexplicable closeness to God, a sense that the ground itself remembered the moment heaven leaned close to a broken man. Keziah often paused in those places, letting the wind carry her unspoken prayers. Although the scriptures never record her words, Keziah carried a voice within her that spoke through the way she lived. She embraced simplicity, choosing quiet observation over loud declarations. This made some people underestimate her, but those who looked beyond the surface saw a young woman whose spirit radiated wisdom far beyond her years. Her presence reminded them that restoration is not always loud. Sometimes it is gentle, steady, and unseen, like fragrance diffusing through the air. Her relationship with God grew in the silent corners of her home. She did not seek him with extravagant rituals, but with a heart eager to understand the purpose behind suffering. She pondered questions most young women her age never considered. Why does God allow the crushing? Why does faith bloom brightest in wounded soil? What does it mean to be part of a story that began in ashes? These questions did not frighten her, they shaped her. Each one pulled her closer to the God who had carried her father through catastrophe. There were days when Keziah felt the weight of her name with unusual intensity. Knowing that Cassia's aroma came only through crushing made her wonder if her life too would require breaking. She did not fear the idea but held it with reverence, understanding that any calling worth fulfilling demands sacrifice. Though young, she sensed that God marked her not for comfort, but for depth. Her identity was inseparable from the mystery of transformation. Her mother often watched her with an expression of delicate pride. She understood that Keziah was different, not because she was better than her sisters, but because her spirit carried the echo of what Job had become after encountering God in the whirlwind. Keziah had inherited that stillness, that reverence that comes from seeing life shaken to its foundations and rebuilt with holy hands. She was the fragrance of a faith that had been purified, and her mother saw it clearly. Visitors who entered Job's household frequently found themselves drawn to Keziah without knowing why. Conversations with her were simple, yet they left feeling uplifted, as though they had inhaled something refreshing. She did not speak often, but when she did, her words carried a weight that lingered. People would later say that something about her reminded them of hope, hope that rises quietly, without fanfare, in the hearts of those who have been touched by grace. As the years went by, Keziah became increasingly aware of the silence surrounding her story. She realized that God had chosen not to record her deeds or conversations for a reason. Her purpose was not tied to achievements, but to being, a living testimony that faith is not always proclaimed through actions, but embodied through essence. She learned that some stories are meant to be felt rather than told, like a fragrance that lingers long after the source is gone. This realization freed her from the pressure to prove herself. While others sought recognition, Keziah sought understanding. While others defined purpose by what they accomplished, she defined it by who they became. Her heart turned toward the unseen, toward the God who valued character more than legacy. She often whispered to him in the stillness of the night, asking that her life reflect his presence in a way no words ever could. Her father's wisdom became her compass. He taught her that suffering does not diminish a person, it reveals what cannot be shaken. He shared with her the deepest truth he had learned, that God is closest in the moments when the world feels most silent. Keziah carried those words like a lantern inside her chest. They guided her through every uncertainty, reminding her that the crushing had purpose and that the fragrance of faith was not wasted. The more she grew, the more she understood that her existence itself was a declaration. God restores differently than the world expects. She realized that she did not need to be remembered for great deeds to have significance. The divine imprint upon her life was enough. Her purpose was to reflect the beauty that emerges after loss, the grace that follows grief. She was the quiet bloom after a storm, the fragrance born from crushed bark, the testimony hidden in the details of the scripture. And so Keziah stepped into adulthood with a confidence that did not shout but bloomed. She accepted her calling, not as a burden, but as a gift, the gift of embodying a truth greater than herself. She understood that she was not simply a daughter of Job. She was a daughter of restoration, a living reminder that God writes his most powerful messages in the margins of stories and in the hearts of those the world overlooks. Her silence was her strength, and her life was the incense rising from the altar of a redeemed family. As Keziah stepped into maturity, the quiet purpose woven into her life began to unfold with greater clarity. She was no longer a child shadowed by her father's past, but a woman whose presence carried the weight of divine symbolism. Though her story remained unwritten in the scrolls of human history, heaven had never lost sight of her. Keziah understood that impact is not measured by how loudly a life echoes, but by the fragrance it leaves behind. And hers was a fragrance born from a lineage that had learned to worship through brokenness. One of the greatest honors of her life came the day Job divided his inheritance. In a powerful break from cultural norms, he placed his daughters beside their brothers as equal heirs. The murmurs that spread across the land of Uz were loud, but Job stood unmoved. Keziah watched the scene with quiet reverence, realizing the significance of that moment. Her father was not merely distributing wealth, he was making a declaration of restored dignity. By giving his daughters an inheritance, Job proclaimed that God's grace does not favor according to tradition, but according to his own boundless justice. The weight of her portion was not in the gold or livestock, but in what it represented. For Keziah, the inheritance symbolized the transformation of her father's heart. Before his suffering, Job had been an honorable man. After the whirlwind, he had become a man shaped by divine revelation. She understood that the gift she received was an echo of God's inclusiveness, a sign that his restoration transcends human boundaries. That understanding humbled her and tethered her more deeply to her calling. As time passed, her presence became a quiet refuge for many. People who had endured loss or carried silent wounds often found themselves drawn to Keziah. They sensed in her a depth that made room for their pain. She did not offer quick answers or platitudes. Instead, she offered presence, the kind that sits beside sorrow without fear. It was a gift born from the legacy of her father's suffering, passed down not through teaching but through example. Keziah learned that healing is sometimes found not in spoken wisdom, but in companionship anchored in grace. There were nights when she would walk alone under the stars, letting the wind brush against her face, as though carrying whispers from heaven. She pondered the mysteries of God's ways, the strange intertwining of suffering and blessing, the silent work of restoration that transforms a life from within. Though she had never experienced the agony her father endured, she felt its imprint on her soul. She understood that she had been born not into pain, but into purpose, a purpose shaped by the ashes of a story that had nearly ended. The people of Uz frequently remarked on the beauty of Job's daughters, but Keziah knew her true beauty was spiritual, not physical. It came from being part of a testimony written by God himself. When others admired her, she felt compelled to redirect the praise toward the one who restores. She lived with the awareness that everything about her, her name, her presence, her legacy, was tied to a divine narrative. She was not the hero of the story. She was the fragrance of the lesson the story carried. As she grew older, Keziah developed a deep tenderness toward those who felt forgotten. She understood what it meant to be mentioned briefly, but carry profound significance. Her own story had taught her that God often hides his greatest messages in the details others overlook. So she sought out the unnoticed, the voiceless, the ones whose lives seemed insignificant to society. In them, she saw the same quiet potential she carried, the potential to reflect God in subtle yet powerful ways. Her life became a quiet song of gratitude. Each day felt like borrowed light, each blessing a reminder that God had turned a house of mourning into a place of beauty. She often helped her mother in the household tasks, not out of obligation, but out of love for the life God had restored. She embraced humility, knowing that true greatness is not found in recognition, but in surrender. Her heart remained anchored in the truth that had defined her since childhood. God brings fragrance out of what has been crushed. Though the scripture does not tell us how Keziah's life ended, it is impossible to imagine her fading without purpose. Those who knew her surely carried memories of her presence long after she was gone. She left a legacy, not of great deeds, but of great essence, a spiritual imprint that lingered in the hearts of those touched by her gentleness. Her story became part of the heritage of Job's descendants, a reminder that God restores not simply by returning what was lost, but by revealing new dimensions of beauty. As her hair silvered with age, Keziah often sat outside her tent at dusk, watching the horizon soften into shades of gold and violet. She admired the way the sky glowed after the sun had endured the heat of the day. Much like a life glows after weathering seasons of trial, she felt a kinship with those colors, as though they were a reflection of her own journey, a quiet radiance born from a story that could have ended in despair, but instead bloomed into grace. When her final days approached, Keziah faced them with serenity. She had lived her life rooted in divine meaning, carrying the fragrance of cassia in her spirit. Those who gathered around her felt they were witnessing not an ending, but a fulfillment, as though her entire life had been a soft offering rising to heaven. The silence that surrounded her passing was the same silence that had shaped her story, profound, gentle, and full of God. And so, though no scripture records her final words, Keziah continues to speak. Her legacy endures in the simple truth her life embodied, that restoration is not merely the returning of what was lost, but the creation of something new and fragrant from the ashes. She remains a symbol for all generations that God does not waste suffering. He transforms it. He breathes beauty into broken places. He makes the crushed fragrant. And through Keziah, he left us a message that still lingers in the air of faith. There is always perfume in the ashes when God is the one who restores.